according to the biography of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle by biography.com, in 1886, A Tangled Skein was the first mystery novel written by Doyle. It was later renamed to A Study in Scarlet and was published in the Beaton Christmas Annual, a British paperback magazine 2 years later. A Study in Scarlet was the first out of 60 stories about Sherlock Holmes, and it eventually snowballs into a massive hit over the span of his career. The book that we have chosen to analyze is titled A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Doyle. A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Doyle marks the first appearance of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. The book was published back in July 1888, and it attracted little public interest when it was first published, but it was well received by readers. The story revolves around Dr. Watson, who just returned from the Second Anglo-Afghan War in search of a place to live. An old friend of his introduces the idea of meeting Sherlock Holmes, a brilliant young detective, to split the rent at a flat. The story is split into two parts: the reminiscence of Watson and the Country of Saints. The reason A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Doyle was chosen is because it is the first published novel featuring Sherlock Holmes. The series eventually becomes one of the most influential and popular pieces of literature that are loved by its readers and considered as a literary masterpiece. Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle, mostly known as Arthur Doyle, was born on May 22, 1859 in Edinburgh, Scotland. He studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh Medical School from 1876 to 1881. Before becoming a writer, he worked as a ship's surgeon during a voyage to West Africa. Eventually, he balanced the time between medicine and writing after settling down in Portsmouth while setting up his medical practice, which was not very successful. He spent his time writing fictions whenever he was not busy or not having any patients at the moment. Arthur Doyle also wrote many stories in different genres such as fantasy and science fiction, as well as plays, romance, poetry, non-fiction, and historical novels. Even though Sherlock Holmes was his most well-known work, he still enjoyed writing other stories.
Vinay and Darbelnet propose that there are 7 translation procedures, and they are all divided into 2 categories, which are direct translation and oblique translation. Direct translation is when the target text translation follows the source text words as closely as possible. There are 3 procedures that fall under this category, which are borrowing, calque, and literal translation. Now, let's see some direct translation procedure that Imam Yusuf used. The first one is calque. Walensky stated that calque, or loan translation, is when a target language, or TL, borrows an expression from the source language, or SL, by literally translating each of its elements. There are 2 different calque, which are lexical calque and structural calque. Lexical calque is when the translator preserves and respects the syntactic structure of the TL while at the same time introducing a new mode of expression. For example, Islamic banking is translated as perbankan Islam. The affix per and an is still preserved in the Malay translation. The second type is structural calque. This type introduces a new construction into the language. Some examples that we can see are Prime Minister and science fiction, which are translated to Perdana Menteri and science fiction in Bahasa Melayu. There are a few times Imam Yusuf used lexical calque. One example that we can see is on page 13 of the original book. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote, "Commission NASA," he said gruffly, "uniform away for repairs." "And you were?" I asked with a slightly malicious glance at my companion. "A surgeon, sir. Royal Marine Light Infantry, sir." "No answer?" "Right, sir." Meanwhile, the Malay version on page 28 was written as below. "Saya seorang pengawal pintu, tuan." Dia menjawab dengan suara yang garau. "Saya memakai pakaian biasa hari ini kerana saya menghantar uniform ke kedai jahit untuk dibaiki." "Sebelum awak menjadi pengawal pintu?" tanya saya sambil menjaling tajam ke arah rakan saya. "Saya bekas surgeon dalam infanteri ringan Marin Diraja, tuan. Kalau tiada apa-apa lagi, saya minta diri dahulu, tuan." Imam Yusuf did not translate the word Royal Marine Light Infantry word by word to Diraja Marine Ringan Infantry, which sounds weird, especially to native Malay speakers. Instead, he kept the syntactic structure of the Malay language whilst making sure that it was grammatically correct by translating the word to infantry ringan marin diraja.
Borrowing is the simplest of all translation techniques since it includes employing foreign wording in the target text. Perhaps a fascinating part of borrowing, as Vinay and Darbonet 1958 pointed out, is the ability to create specific stylistic effects, such as injecting the taste of foreign culture into the translation. Borrowing is transferring words from one language to another without having to translate them. A simple example would be common words like spaghetti or pizza. When borrowed words are considered foreign, they are frequently placed in italics.
In the book A Study of Scarlet, on page 5, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote, "Worn with pain and weak from the prolonged hardship which I had undergone, I was removed with a great train of wounded sufferers to the base hospital at Peshawar." Meanwhile, the Malay version on page 9 is written as, "Akibat kecederaan itu, saya mengalami kesakitan dan berada dalam keadaan yang lemah. Saya dipindahkan dengan kereta api ke Hospital Pangkalan Peshawar bersama anggota tentera lain yang cedera." In both the original and translated text, the word hospital was spelled and used in the same way without any modification whatsoever.
Transposition, modulation, equivalence, and adaptation translation techniques are all examples of oblique translations, in which the translator interprets, elaborates, or summarizes the stated contents of the original. Rather than direct translation, oblique translations relies on interpretive similarities to work independently.
Other than that, Iman Yusof also applied modulation. It happens when translators change the form of the message by changing its perspective. Hardin and Ginthia explain that the procedure involves a change in point of view that allows translators to express the same situation differently. It also changes the perception of the reader indirectly. A typical example is when something considered negative in the SL turns into something positive in the TL. Like when we say, undoubtedly, we do not say tidak ragu-ragu, but instead we say ternyatalah. In the original book on page 5, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote, "Whatever have you been doing with yourself, Watson?" he asked in undisguised wonder as we rattled through the crowded London streets. "You are as thin as a lath and as brown as a nut." I gave him a short sketch of my adventures and had hardly concluded it by the time that we reached our destination. Meanwhile, the Malay version on page 9 is written as, "Kereta kuda kami bergerak melalui jalan-jalan yang sesak di kota London." Dia bertanya dengan perasaan ingin tahu yang membuak-buak. "Awak apa khabar sekarang, Watson? Saya nampak awak cengkung dan kurus kering." Saya menceritakan pengalaman hidup saya secara ringkas. Selesai sahaja saya bercerita, kami pun sampai ke destinasi. The literal translation for undisguised wonder should be keheranan yang tidak dibendung. However, the author decided to change the words into perasaan ingin tahu yang membuak-buak.
Let's move on to transposition. Transposition is the process of altering the meaning of text by substituting one word class with another without changing the message's meaning. It can be used intralinguistically, that is within a particular language, according to Walensky. Transposition is a very flexible translation method. So as an example, this house was designed by John Hardy. Translated will be, "Rumah ini hasil reka cipta John Hardy." The word design is not literally translated to reka bentuk in Malay. Instead, the past tense changes the word form but not the meaning into reka cipta.
In the book A Study of Scarlet, on page 5, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote, "In the year 1878, I took my degree of Doctor of Medicine of the University of London and proceeded to Natalie to go through the courses prescribed for surgeons in the army. Meanwhile, the Malaysian version on the page 7 is written as, pada tahun 1878 saya menamatkan pengajian di University of London dengan kelulusan ijazah kedoktoran. The literal translation for degree could be interpreted into either ijazah or darjah, as the word degree could mean something else in the academic as an academic degree, an extent to which something happened, or a unit of measurement. In this case, the word degree implies the academic degree and translates to ijazah.
By looking at the translated version of the book, the translation word is good. There are several minor errors and aspects that one would personally perform differently compared to that of the translator. The translator often resorted to applying the translation procedure equivalence in oblique sentences that can be translated using transposition or literal methods and vice versa. The table of contents show an example of implementing literal translation instead of transposition. Our advertisement brings a visitor phrase was directly translated to iklan kami membawa tetamu. This is grammatically inaccurate in Malay as the translated sentence structure is hanging. Besides, transposition should be applied instead of the literal approach, considering membawa in Malay means to carry something while moving to another place, whereas mengundang is more accurate because it means to invite or request someone to go somewhere, which is also contextually accurate. Contrastingly, the flower of utah was translated by implementing equivalence sekuntum bunga pujaan di utah phrase instead of the literal translation that is sekuntum bunga di utah. No added or equivalent words are needed to make the Malay sentence structurally correct. In addition, there are some inconsistencies in the approach the translator took in translating the book, and it involves terms closely related to religion. For example, in the table of contents, John Ferrier talks with the Prophet was translated to John Ferrier berbicara dengan pemimpin Mormon. Equivalence was implemented, presumably because the word prophet holds a high value in Islam, a religion that most Malays practice and adhere to. It is a taboo act to perform by literally translating it to John Ferrier berbicara dengan Nabi. Here, the translator applied equivalence by replacing the word Nabi with pemimpin Mormon, instead to show the reader the bigger picture of the chapter and that person is not an actual Nabi as taught in Islamic teachings. On the contrary, the next chapter, the Avenging Angels, was directly translated to Malaikat Pembela. The reason behind this is presumably there is no suitable synonym for Malaikat. In English, an angel can be replaced with guardian or spirit, which will be contextually correct in terms of referring to the same thing, unlike in Malay, where culturally, penjaga or semangat usually implies demons instead of angels. Last but not least, the translator also applied Morwi method instead of translating. The chapter The Lauriston Garden Mystery is literally translated into Mystery the Lauriston Garden. Lauriston Garden is a place name and they did not translate the word to Taman Lauriston. Supposedly, borrowing means retaining the cultural context of the word in the sentence when there is no equivalent word in the target language. It is probably a personal choice by the translator to preserve the actual name of the place, instead of translating garden to taman.
Overall, the quality of the translation is good despite having a few minor setbacks that can be improved. Well, the translator implemented various translation procedures and used appropriate phrases that fits the story's narration during the translation process of A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Doyle. As mentioned earlier, the book was chosen because it is the first published novel featuring Sherlock Holmes in the series that garners popularity and fame with time. In conclusion, the translator Iman Yusuf incorporated translation procedures such as direct translation procedures, which involves lexical cult, a derivation of cult, and borrowing such as Royal Marine Light Infantry to Infantry Ringan Marine Raja, and the word hospital respectively. Furthermore, the usage of oblique translation procedures was visible throughout the story, which are modulations and transposition. An example of modulation is undisguised wonder to perasaan ingin tahu yang membuat buak. Meanwhile, one of the examples of transposition is the word emaciated, which translates to kurus kering. The translator Iman Yusof did an excellent job translating A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Doyle from English to Malay.